The ice surrounding the ship had not merely frozen solid, it had transformed into a living, extremely aggressive entity, thirsting for destruction. The dull, guttural creaking of the wooden hull was the only sound that accompanied George DeLong during those endless polar hours. The temperature outside had dropped so low that his very breath turned into sharp crystals, immediately settling on the captain's thick beard. The horizon, which only recently had promised the glory of being the first to discover the North Pole, was now hidden behind ice ridges as tall as a 3-story house. It was June 1881, but summer here existed only in calendars and the sailors' memories. At first, the crew of the Jeannette tried to convince themselves that this was a temporary obstacle, a routine delay on the way to their great goal. Every small crack in the ice field was perceived as a long-awaited sign of salvation and a quick escape to open water. But days turned into weeks, and the icy grip tightened ever more, lifting the ship above the surface of the frozen ocean. Hope slowly gave way to a heavy anxiety that seeped into people's hearts, along with the eternal damp cold. They did not yet realize that they had become prisoners of the harshest and most merciless desert on the entire planet. The world they had left behind in San Francisco, to the sounds of orchestras and the joyful shouts of the crowd, continued to live its bustling and distant life. Here, however, time seemed to have frozen in an icy eternity, where every shift of the ice could be the last for their fragile human refuge. The crew operated on autopilot, carrying out routine orders and maintaining strict discipline, as if that could protect them from the fury of the elements. But nature had already passed its judgment, and there was no provision in the Arctic for appealing this decision. There was no way back, and ahead of them lay only an endless white void, devoid of life and mercy. It was at that very moment that George DeLong ceased to be a proud explorer, carrying his country's flag to the top of the world. Amid the deafening crack of breaking bulkheads, he became a mere mortal, desperately fighting for the right to take his next breath. The story of his ambitions ended here, off the coast of Siberia, giving way to the chronicle of a slow and agonizing struggle for survival. They were left completely alone, cut off from civilization and abandoned to their fate in an icy prison. And this waiting for the end was far more terrifying than any raging storm or naval battle. The ice pressed in from all sides, creating a monstrous pressure that the human mind simply refused to accept as reality. Huge blocks, weighing tens of tons, slowly crept up the sides of the Jeannette, like the giant fingers of an unknown monster. George DeLong stood on the deck, feeling through the soles of his boots how the wood beneath his feet was vibrating and trembling. The air was filled with a sound resembling the cannonade of hundreds of heavy guns, firing without pause directly into the ship's hull. It was the agony of a ship built to battle waves, but not the solid ocean. The captain watched the gauges and saw the needles tremble, reflecting the inhuman strain on the structure of his only home. Water began to flood the holds, despite the desperate work of the steam pumps and the efforts of the exhausted sailors. Each new blow from the ice field caused the ship to list more and more, turning the deck into a slippery and dangerous slide. The men worked in complete silence, realizing that words no longer held any meaning or weight here. The awareness of disaster hung over them like the black shadow of the polar night, ready to swallow up all living things. The wooden bulkheads cracked with a dry sound, like rifle shots right next to the ears of the frozen sailors. DeLong watched as massive oak beams buckled, unable to withstand the pressure of millions of tons of Arctic ice. The captain's face remained impassive, as if carved from the very ice that was slowly killing his dream. He knew that the time for prayers was over, and the time had come to make the hardest decisions of his life. The ship was no longer a fortress. It was turning into a trap, ready to snap shut at any second. The sailors' eyes were fixed on the captain, searching in him for even a shadow of confidence or hope of salvation. But DeLong saw in those eyes only a reflection of his own fear, which he had tried so carefully to hide. The north wind carried with it the scent of eternal cold and fine snow dust that clogged the folds of their clothing. The icy fields around them bucked and twisted, creating bizarre and ominous labyrinths from which there was no visible escape. The situation worsened with every passing minute, robbing the men of their last shreds of faith in a favorable outcome. At one point, the sound of a tree snapping became so loud that it drowned out even the howl of the furious Arctic wind. The ship's hull buckled inward, and icy water roared into the living quarters, sweeping away everything in its path. The men rushed to the lifeboats, which had been prepared in advance on the ice near the sinking, groaning ship. DeLong was the last to leave the bridge, clutching the ship's log to his chest, the only thing connecting him to the past. He stepped onto the ice, feeling the surface of the world's deepest ocean tremble beneath his feet. They stood on the ice floe and watched as the Jeanette slowly sank beneath the water, writhing in the icy embrace of Siberia. The ship's masts, which had so recently proudly carried sails, now snapped pitifully against the edges of the ice floe like dry matches. The last distress signal had been sent into the void many months ago, and no one could hear their cries. The water closed over the ship's remains, leaving on the surface only a handful of people and mountains of their pitiful equipment. Now they were surrounded only by an endless white desert, where there was no place for the weak and the doubting. The temperature continued to drop, turning the sailors' damp clothing into icy armor that restricted their every movement. DeLong scanned his men, seeing on their faces the mark of doom and deep, paralyzing shock. No one dared to speak first. The silence on the ice was so thick that one could feel it physically. The cold began its slow work, seeping through the fur and wool, straight to the bones of the exhausted men. This was the first hour of their new life, a life where every step could be their last on this journey. The surroundings looked hostile and alien, as if they had found themselves on another planet, devoid of oxygen and warmth. The ice ridges on the horizon resembled the ruins of ancient cities, buried in snow and forgotten by all living creatures. DeLong felt an icy emptiness settling in his heart, displacing all his former ambitions and scientific theories. He was no longer the leader of a scientific expedition. He had become a guide into the realm of death for his people. Every decision now came at the cost of a human life, and this responsibility weighed on him heavier than the ice. The crew's physical condition left much to be desired. Many were suffering from the early stages of scurvy and old, non-healing wounds. The constant stress and malnutrition of the past months had turned the sturdy sailors into shadows of their former selves, pale and emaciated. The captain understood that a journey of hundreds of miles lay ahead of them across the most treacherous terrain on Earth. They needed to set up camp and distribute supplies before the darkness of the polar twilight engulfed them completely. Their feet sank into deep snow, making every step across the ice floe a grueling and exhausting ordeal. They did not know it yet, but this was the moment when they ceased to be explorers and officially became survivors. The situation worsened by the hour as the ice floe beneath their feet began to show signs of instability and movement. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of drifting ice and the icy waters of the Laptev Sea, separating them from the Siberian coast. DeLong ordered preparations to begin for a trek on foot, fully aware of how slim their chances of success were. The Arctic had no intention of killing them quickly. It had prepared a long and agonizing test of their will for them. It all began with grand plans in the warm, well-lit offices of wealthy patrons on the other side of the world. George DeLong sincerely believed in the theory of an open polar sea, which was supposed to lie beyond the belt of eternal ice. This idea seemed so logical and appealing that he easily found support from the owner of the New York Herald. Preparations for the expedition were carried out on an American scale. The best equipment was purchased, and the most experienced and proven sailors were hired. At that moment, the future seemed bright, full of discoveries and a triumphant return home with victory. The ship Jeanette was specially reinforced to withstand the ice and equipped with a steam engine that was powerful for its time. The crew consisted of 33 men, each of whom was ready to sacrifice himself for the sake of science and glory. In July 1879, they left San Francisco to the enthusiastic cheers of a crowd of thousands. The sails gleamed white in the sun, and the harbor's cannons fired a farewell salute, seeing the heroes off on their great and perilous journey. Confidence in success was absolute, backed by scientific data and the power of modern technology. They planned to sail through the Bering Strait and, using the warm current, quickly reach the North Pole itself. The maps of that time contained many blank spots, which DeLong dreamed of filling with the names of his companions and sponsors. Every evening in the wardroom, lively debates raged about what exactly the top of the world looked like and what riches it held. The sailors read books about previous expeditions, believing that their preparation was far better and their ship more reliable. No one imagined that the Arctic would greet them not with warm seas, but with an endless ice sheet. The first weeks of the voyage only reinforced their optimism. The weather was clear, and the sea was free of large ice fields. They passed Alaska and entered the Chukchi Sea, hoping for a quick and easy victory over the harsh natural environment. DeLong kept a meticulous log, recording meteorological observations and sketching the outlines of the new shores they had discovered. It seemed to him that fortune favors the bold, and that a great discovery was already waiting for them just around the next bend. The contrast between this initial hope and the impending disaster was simply staggering and unimaginable. However, soon the sea began to change, taking on a leaden hue and becoming heavy with floating ice floes. The air temperature dropped sharply, and fog began to obscure the horizon for hours on end, depriving the navigators of the ability to orient themselves. On September 6, 1879, the Janet encountered a solid ice field near Wrangel Island. The captain hoped to break through the ice jam using the power of the steam engine, but the ice proved stronger than human technology. On that day, the ship came to a halt, and this stop dragged on for a long 21 months. At first, it seemed like an annoying delay that could easily be weathered by using their supplies of provisions and coal. The crew continued to conduct scientific research, take water samples, and measure the depth of the ocean beneath the keel. They believed that the spring thaw would free the ship and allow them to continue their journey to the coveted pole. The wintering was organized by the book. The ship was insulated with snow, and an observatory was set up on the ice to watch the stars. But nature had no intention of conforming to human plans and schedules. It lived by its own laws. The ice began to drift, carrying the Janet far to the northwest, away from its intended course and any hope of rescue. Months turned into years, and the ship remained trapped in a vice that only tightened with each passing winter. DeLong watched as their coal supplies dwindled, and his men's faces grew pale from a lack of sunlight and fresh food. Psychological tension mounted, for uncertainty is the most fearsome enemy of even the strongest crew. They had become hostages to the currents that carried them into the unknown, robbing them of any chance to control their own fate. The second winter in the ice was much harder than the first, sapping the strength and health of even the toughest sailors. DeLong tried to keep spirits high by organizing celebrations and lectures, but the men's laughter grew increasingly forced. The walls of the cabins were covered with frost, and the air became so damp that their clothes never dried completely. The men began to realize that their scientific mission was turning into a struggle for basic survival in extreme conditions. They were alone in the very heart of the icy ocean, and the world was gradually beginning to forget about the existence of their expedition. The captains spent long hours poring over maps, trying to predict the course of their forced drift and find a path to salvation. But the maps offered no answers. They only highlighted the vast distances separating them from the nearest human habitation. The dream of the pole gave way to a dream of solid ground, of the scent of grass, and the warmth of a real hearth. DeLong saw the spirits of some of his men break under the weight of endless waiting and cold. Every day brought new trials, testing their resilience and loyalty to their oath and duty. When the ice finally began to crack the ship's hull, it became the inevitable conclusion of their long and agonizing journey. Faith in the invincibility of technology had finally collapsed, leaving the men alone to face the primal power of the elements. They realized that all their preparations had been nothing more than a pitiful attempt to defend themselves against the unbeatable. Now, a real-life hell awaited them, where every mistake came at the cost of a painful death in the freezing cold. The story of great discoveries had ended, giving way to a bloody drama of survival that could not be prevented. The critical moment came suddenly, though its approach had been felt in every creak of the hull for many days. On June 11th, 1881, the ice around the Jeannette began to move violently and uncontrollably. The pressure became so monstrous that the ship was simply pushed to the surface like a small splinter. The wooden frames burst with a deafening sound that the men would remember for the rest of their lives. It was a turning point, after which a return to their former lives became definitively impossible. DeLong ordered an immediate evacuation, realizing that the ship could sink at any moment under the weight of the ice. The sailors frantically unloaded boxes of hardtack, barrels of salted meat, and the most essential scientific equipment onto the ice. Everything took place in conditions of bitter cold, and the constant threat of ice floes crashing down right on top of them. Supplies were distributed among 3 lifeboats, which were now to become their only means of transportation. The captain personally oversaw the loading of charts and chronometers, realizing that without them they were doomed. Contact with the outside world had been lost long ago, but now the physical refuge the ship had provided was gone as well. The crew stood on the ice, watching as their home slowly sank into the dark abyss of the icy ocean. It was a sight that made the blood run cold, even in the veins of the toughest and most experienced sea dogs. At that moment, each of them felt infinitely small and vulnerable in the face of the mighty Arctic. The ship vanished beneath the water, leaving behind only a whirlpool and a few pieces of driftwood. DeLong gathered everyone around him to announce the start of their desperate journey to the shores of distant Siberia. His voice sounded firm, but deep down he understood how slim their chances of a safe rescue were. They would have to travel more than 500 miles across drifting ice, dragging heavy boats and sleds behind them. It was a decision born of utter desperation, but there was simply no other way. The men began to realize that their former lives were over forever, giving way to an endless struggle. The first few miles of the journey revealed the full severity of the ordeal ahead for people exhausted and weakened by a long winter. The snow was deep and the ice was constantly shifting, creating cracks and open water that they had to go around for miles. The sleds weighed hundreds of pounds, and 10 sailors had to harness themselves to each one just to get it moving. Their hands were rubbed raw by the ropes, and their feet constantly sank into the icy water, hidden beneath a thin layer of ice. Physical exhaustion set in alarmingly quickly, robbing the men of the strength and will to keep moving. The cold became their constant companion, seeping under their clothes and depriving them of proper rest, even while they slept. The tents offered no protection from the biting wind that howled over the icy fields, never ceasing for a moment. Food was scarce, and fresh water had to be obtained by melting snow over precious oil, which was running out quickly. DeLong saw the last glimmer of hope fade from his men's eyes, replaced by a dull, apathetic despair. The situation worsened with each passing day, turning the expedition into an endless ordeal for both body and spirit. The bonds between the crew members began to crack under the pressure of unbearable conditions and the constant, gnawing fear of death. Minor conflicts flared up over every extra spoonful of sugar or a spot by the campfire, which was barely smouldering. The captain had to use all his power and authority to maintain a semblance of order and discipline in the camp. He understood that as soon as they ceased to be a united whole, the Arctic would swallow them up one by one. But maintaining unity was becoming increasingly difficult when their stomachs were empty and their legs would not obey them. Gradually, the men began to discard items that had recently seemed essential and of the utmost importance. Scientific instruments, heavy books, and personal mementos were left on the ice, becoming part of this lifeless landscape. The only things that mattered were food, ammunition, and the strength to take at least one more step south. DeLong watched with a heavy heart as the fruits of his many years of labor were thrown into the snow because they were no longer needed. Priorities had shifted radically, revealing the true essence of human existence in the face of disaster. The Arctic did not try to kill them immediately, It slowly sucked the life out of them, relishing their suffering. The days merged into one endless sequence of pain, cold and unbearable, exhausting labor at the limit of their strength. DeLong watched as his men turned into the living dead, driven only by a blind instinct for self-preservation. The moment when everything began to fall apart was long past, paving the way for the complete destruction of the human spirit. They pressed on because stopping meant immediate and certain death in the snow. The decay of their bodies began with the gums, which grew soft and began to bleed at the slightest touch. Scurvy, that eternal, accursed companion of sailors, began its harvest among DeLong's weakened and starving men. Old wounds, sustained back on the ship, suddenly reopened, turning into festering sores that would not heal in the cold. Legs swelled, becoming like logs, and every step caused a sharp, piercing pain throughout the tortured body. The human body was wasting away, exposing a fragile skeleton and nerves stretched to the limit. The cold ceased to be merely an external factor. It had firmly taken root inside each of the 33 surviving sailors. They lost feeling in their fingers and toes, which gradually turned black from irreversible frostbite. Their faces were covered with a crust of ice and soot from the oil lamps, transforming the men into something resembling ghastly ghosts. Breathing was difficult. The cold air burned their lungs, causing a constant, agonizing, dry cough. Their bodies were running on their last reserves, burning their own tissues to maintain minimal warmth in the heart. Hunger became not just a sensation, but an obsession that overshadowed all other thoughts and human feelings. Rations were reduced to a few pieces of dry bread and a tiny scrap of salted meat, not even enough for a child. People began chewing the leather of their boots and belts, trying to trick their stomachs, which constantly demanded real food. Their eyes sunken, their cheekbones sharp, and their skin took on an unhealthy, sallow hue characteristic of severe exhaustion. Their strength left them slowly, like water flowing from a broken vessel that could not be repaired. The Arctic wilderness seemed endless, devoid of any landmarks or signs of life for hundreds of miles around. The color white in all its forms caused snow blindness, stinging the eyes and robbing them of the ability to see the way. The emptiness of the horizon weighed on their minds more heavily than any storm, creating a sense of utter hopelessness in their situation. They were the only living beings in this dead world, and this realization evoked a deep, existential terror. Each new day brought only more snow, more ice, and more unbearable, ringing silence. The physical consequences of frostbite became increasingly evident and frightening for everyone on the expedition. DeLong had to perform primitive surgeries right on the ice, cutting away dead tissue with a simple hunting knife. The cries of the wounded were drowned out by the howling wind, evoking nothing in the others but a dull and indifferent sympathy. Sensitivity to pain had dulled, giving way to a state of apathy and complete indifference to their own future fate. People turned into automatons, carrying out a single command to keep moving south. Their weakness had become so great that overcoming even a small ice hummock took several hours of grueling labor. Sailors fell into the snow and could not get up for a long time, lacking the strength even to simply open their eyes. DeLong had to literally kick and shout at the men to get them moving, knowing that any stop meant the end. His own body was also refusing to obey. Every breath came with an incredible, titanic effort of will, but the responsibility for the lives of others kept pushing him forward through the pain and complete exhaustion of his body. Gradually, the team lost not only their physical strength, but also basic hygiene and their human appearance. Their clothes turned into filthy rags, soaked in sweat, salt, and soot, which went unchanged for months. The stench of decay and unwashed bodies filled the tents, becoming the familiar backdrop to their miserable existence. They stopped washing themselves and cleaning their clothes, conserving every movement and every drop of precious warmth. Civilization was receding, leaving room only for primitive survival instincts in an extremely hostile environment. The Arctic was grinding them down, stripping them of hope, health, and their very humanity, turning them into dust on the snow. The horizon remained empty, just like their hearts, scorched by the cold and the endless, agonizing wait for the end. They kept walking, But this path no longer led them to salvation, but into the eternal silence of the Siberian ice. The moment of final collapse came when they finally reached open water, only to realize that this was not the end of their suffering. 3 boats were launched into the Laptev Sea to cover the remaining distance to the mouth of the Great Lena River. However, a sudden and violent storm scattered them in different directions, depriving them of the ability to maintain visual contact. DeLong watched as the boat commanded by Chip disappeared into the huge waves, and no one ever saw it again. This was the first major setback that finally undermined the men's faith in the possibility of a collective rescue. They landed on a shore that turned out to be nothing but an endless succession of frozen channels and drifts of ice. Instead of the villages and warmth they had expected, they found only an icy wind and complete emptiness for hundreds of miles around. It was here that the captain came to the terrible realization that no one would come for them. The hope that had glimmered in the sailors' hearts during their journey across the ice began to evaporate rapidly in this icy wilderness. They were on land, but this land was far more hostile and dangerous than the drifting ice of the open ocean. Food was completely gone, and the men began hunting rare birds and small rodents, which were almost impossible to catch. DeLong watched as his men wasted away from hunger right before his eyes, turning into living skeletons covered in skin. The situation had become catastrophic, and no rescue plan could change the course of events anymore. They tried to head south along the river, hoping to encounter at least one person or find traces of a settlement. But the Lena Delta was too vast and tangled, turning into a veritable labyrinth of ice, water, and frozen earth. Every bend in the river brought only new disappointments and the sight of an endless horizon blanketed in snow and ice. They had almost no strength left to move, and the sailors began dying one by one from exhaustion and the cold. The death of their comrades became, for those who remained alive, yet another proof of their own imminent demise. The psychological breakdown was so profound that the men stopped even talking to one another, conserving their last reserves of strength. They sat around tiny fires made of wet driftwood, staring into the flames with empty, lifeless eyes. The fear of death gave way to a dull indifference to what would happen to them in the next minute or hour. DeLong continued to keep a diary, recording the dates and names of those who had remained forever in this god-forsaken land. His handwriting grew increasingly shaky, reflecting the trembling of his hands and the fading of life's energy in his body. At some point, they realized that help would not come, because the world simply did not know where exactly to look for them. Melville, their only hope, could be hundreds of miles away from them if he had even survived this hell. The feeling of being completely abandoned and useless to the whole world became the hardest trial of all for them. They had been heroes of their country, but now they were dying in the mud and snow, forgotten by all their compatriots. The silence of the tundra was the answer to all their prayers and desperate cries for help. DeLong decided to send the 2 strongest sailors, Ninderman and Noros, ahead to search for people and help. It was a last, desperate chance to save at least part of his group from certain and agonizing death. The rest remained behind to wait, gradually losing the ability to move or even simply sit without assistance. The captain knew the chances of the sailors returning with help were slim to none, but he had to try. The days dragged on in an endless succession, filled with the moans of the dying and the whistling of the cold autumn wind. Hunger drove the men to a state where they began to eat things they had previously been afraid to even think about. They boiled pieces of leather from old clothing and tried to gnaw on the bones of dead animals found beneath the snow. The taste of life vanished, leaving only an animalistic desire to fill their stomachs with anything to dull the searing pain. DeLong saw human dignity give way to instinct, but he could not blame anyone for it. In the face of utter hopelessness, moral laws ceased to exist, laying bare the true nature of man. Death began to come every night, taking 1 or 2 people from this small group of the doomed. The living were too weak to bury the dead, and the bodies simply remained lying next to the fire, covered in frost. DeLong recorded the time of each person's death, trying to preserve at least the memory of their names for those who would find them. The The last entries in the diary were brief and full of humility in the face of the inevitable and final end of their journey. He no longer asked for salvation, he asked only that their suffering end as soon as possible. The loss of hope was complete and final, leaving no room for anything but the quiet anticipation of their last breath. They lay in the snow beneath the grey Siberian sky, feeling the cold slowly and surely draw the last remnants of warmth from their bodies. The Arctic had defeated them, broken their will, and turned their ambitions into icy dust in the wind. George DeLong closed his eyes, feeling his consciousness drift into the darkness, where there was no more pain, hunger, or eternal cold. This was the end of a great expedition that had turned into one of the most terrible tragedies in the history of polar exploration. The story of DeLong's group's survival ended in October 1881 in the snow-covered Lena River Delta. Only 2 sailors sent ahead, Ninderman and Noros, miraculously stumbled upon a local settlement and were saved. They were so exhausted and traumatized that for a long time they could not explain exactly where their captain and the rest of the crew had remained. But their rescue was only the beginning of a long and agonizing search for the bodies of those who never made it. The tragedy took on its final horrific form in the eyes of the global public and the loved ones of the victims. Engineer Melville, who led the 3rd lifeboat, showed incredible courage and perseverance in the search for his missing captain. After his rescue, he immediately organized a search expedition, despite the approaching winter and his own severe injuries. He combed the endless channels of the Lena River for several months, refusing to believe the worst until the very last moment. In March 1882, he finally found the site of George DeLong's group's final camp. The sight that met his eyes was enough to drive any man mad. The bodies of the dead sailors lay in the snow, preserved almost perfectly thanks to the permafrost and the constant bitter cold. DeLong was found with his hand raised, as if he were trying to make a final entry in his journal before death. Beside him lay his loyal assistants, frozen in the very poses in which their last breaths had caught them in this hell. Melville gathered all the documents, journals, and personal belongings that had managed to survive beneath the snow and ice over those long months. It was a return of the dead, whose voices now spoke only from the pages of journals yellowed by moisture. Of the 33 men who left San Francisco, only 13 remained alive, scattered across various parts of Siberia. The bodies of DeLong and his group were initially buried in a mass grave atop a hill in the Lena Delta under a granite cross. Later, the American government arranged for the remains to be transported back to their homeland to be buried with the military honors befitting heroes. This ceremony became an act of national mourning, reminding everyone of the price people pay for their quest for the unknown. But for the victims themselves, all these honors no longer held any meaning or significance whatsoever. The surviving crew members returned home changed men, bearing the scars of their suffering and irreparable losses. Many of them were never able to return to normal life, suffering from nightmares and poor health. Melville became an admiral, but until the end of his days, he remembered every detail of that terrible search in the snows of Yakutia. The story of the Jeannette became a lesson for all future polar explorers, changing approaches to the preparation and equipment of northern expeditions. It was a victory of the spirit, bought at the price of the utter destruction of the bodies and hopes of an entire generation of explorers. The expedition's scientific findings proved insignificant compared to the scale of the human catastrophe that unfolded in the Siberian ice. The theory of an open polar sea was definitively disproved, proving that the Arctic is a continuous ice sheet. But DeLong's diaries became invaluable material for studying the psychology of human survival in extreme conditions. They showed how quickly the veneer of civilization crumbles and how long the spirit can resist, even in a dead body. The site of the DeLongs sinking in the Lena Delta remains one of the wildest and most inaccessible corners of the planet. The monument on the hill has long since crumbled under the harsh climate, but the earth itself remembers the voices of those who died here. The wind still howls over the channels, covering with snow the tracks once left by exhausted men. This place has become a sanctuary of human resilience, where nature revealed its true, indifferent, and majestic face. No one attempts to conquer this place anymore. They simply bypass it, respecting the silence of the dead. The consequences of this expedition are still felt in polar research to this day, serving as a reminder of the fragility of human life. The story of the Jeanette teaches us that nature is neither hostile nor benevolent. It simply exists beyond human concepts of morality. We can build the most perfect ships, but we will always remain mere guests in this icy realm. Those who survived brought back the knowledge of how little a person needs for happiness and how much for salvation. And this knowledge became their only reward for all the circles of hell they endured in the Siberian ice. The finale of this story is not a triumph of discovery, but the heavy, oppressive silence that still reigns in those parts. The Arctic did not merely kill these people, it took their names and turned their feet into icy dust. Looking at old photographs of the crew, we see the faces of those who believed in their own invincibility and the power of progress. But the ice proved stronger than any machine or human ambition, demonstrating its absolute power over space and time. The fate of the Jeanette is a constant reminder that nature always has the final say. The bodies of the sailors left behind in Siberia eventually became part of the Earth itself, dissolving into the permafrost of the tundra. Those who returned to the United States lived out the rest of their days with a deep sense of guilt toward those who remained in the ice forever. Their lives were divided into before and after, and the latter was filled only with the shadows of the past and the cold. No California sun could warm those who had watched their comrades freeze to death in the Lena Delta. It was a long and agonizing fading of the soul, which ended only with their final breath in warm beds. The world moved on, forgetting the heroes of the past and striving for new, even more daring and dangerous feats. Polar flights and nuclear icebreakers made the Arctic more accessible, but no less dangerous to human life and the human psyche. Yet every time a person steps onto the ice, they must remember those who paved this path with their bodies. The story of the Jeanette is not a heroic saga. It is a warning about the limits of what is permissible for humans in this world. We are but grains of sand in the vast machinery of the universe, which takes no notice of our presence or our suffering. The Arctic was in no hurry to kill them. It simply waited until they themselves succumbed under the weight of circumstances and their own helplessness. It was a passive, and therefore all the more terrifying, violence against human will and faith in salvation. The wind still drives the snow across the vast expanse of the Laptev Sea, concealing beneath it the wreckage of ships and human hopes. Nothing has changed in this icy realm over the past century and a half. Nature remains just as majestic and silent, and in this silence, the echoes of the prayers of those who were forever trapped by the Siberian ice still resonate. Their bodies remain there, beyond the Arctic Circle, having become part of the endless white landscape, devoid of bright colors and warmth. We can build monuments and write books, but we will never fully comprehend the horror they endured. It was a battle in which there were no victors, only the defeated and those who were allowed to leave alive. Jeanette lies at the bottom of the ocean and her captain in the soil of his homeland, but their story belongs to the Arctic, and this ice will never melt, keeping the secret of their final days and hours in eternal silence. The ending must be as heavy as the very ice that crushed their ship and their human destinies. There is no consolation in the fact that science gained new data at the cost of dozens of young and talented lives. It was a tragedy in its purest form, devoid of any meaning or justification in the eyes of the ordinary human mind. We simply record the facts, trying not to shiver from the cold that emanates from every line of this script. The ship vanished, the people perished, and the ice continues its eternal, slow drift around the top of the world. The Arctic did not kill them quickly. It simply waited for them to become part of itself, part of this endless snow. George DeLong became a legend, but a tragic one, a symbol of an impossible journey and unfulfilled expectations. His dream of a warm pole turned into an icy nightmare that lasted for years and ended in the mud of the Siberian Delta. We close this page of history knowing that new ice and new human attempts to conquer the unconquerable await us ahead. But the shadow of the Gender will always loom behind anyone who dares to challenge the North. Let silence be the final chord in this symphony of cold, hunger, and absolute human loneliness amidst the snows. The viewer must feel this cold on their skin as they leave this virtual journey and return to the real world. We leave the heroes where they found their eternal rest, in a land that knows neither spring nor the warmth of the sun. The story has ended, but the ice continues its path, grinding everything in its way into dust. And in this eternal motion, there is no room for pity, only for the endless and cold anticipation of the end. Time has passed, and now we look at these events through the lens of decades, trying to find at least a shred of meaning in them. But meaning eludes us, leaving only a sense of deep sorrow and respect for the courage of the doomed. They pressed on when there was no hope, and they died without cursing their fate or their captain. This was the highest form of human dignity in the face of the absolute and final collapse of all earthly things. And this is the only thing we can take with us from this icy and terrifying story of survival. The Arctic did not defeat their spirit, it merely took their bodies, proving its physical might over fragile matter. The ending of this story sounds like a requiem for all who did not return from their great and dangerous expeditions. We remember their names, but the ice remembers their breath, their fear, and their last word, frozen on their lips. Jeanette was crushed, DeLong is dead, but the story of their struggle remains with us as an eternal example of the strength of the human spirit. And nature continues to wait for new heroes to once again show them its true and merciless face.